Sue Moroney.
Speaker, thank you for the opportunity to rise and speak to the second reading of the Vulnerable Children Bill. Mr Speaker, I wish I could share the member who just resumed his seat, his enthusiasm for how significant this bill is. Yes, this is an issue that does need addressing. It is the Labour Party's view that the government has not grasped this opportunity to deal with the very serious issues that confront the nation's children, that the bill is not as significant as it should have been, and that it falls short on a number of counts. So sadly, if this is the most significant moment in the member's career, I wish it was an awful lot more significant than what it has been. Because, Mr Speaker, we did have the opportunity, and we still have the opportunity in this Parliament, to actually address the issues that do make 285,000 children in this country vulnerable. And instead, the government has chosen to do some things to assist 30,000 children who are deemed to be at risk. Mr Speaker, what I'm referring to is the 285,000 children who, by this government's own estimations, are living in poverty, by this government's own estimations. And sadly, this bill does nothing to address their plight. And even for the children whose plight it does aim to address, sadly it does fall short, because it does aim to address the plight of children who find themselves in situations where they are at risk of being physically or sexually abused. And so they are very, very vulnerable. And I want to just restate, and I'm sure other members, when they've taken calls in this debate, have been clear about this, that no one could be more vulnerable in our society than a child placed at risk in that way. But, Mr Speaker, the bill focuses on people in paid employment and their risk towards vulnerable children, when what we know as a country is that people in paid employment and frontline services with children are not where the vast majority of this harm takes place. What we know is that, in fact, the paid professionals are much less likely to be in a situation of abusing children. That, in fact, it's the unpaid workforce and the volunteer workforce where most of this harm happens. And, Mr Speaker, I was severely disappointed as a member of the Select Committee to discover partway through the submissions on this bill that this bill did nothing and still does nothing to address that very serious and large-scale risk, because, Mr Speaker, we do know that that is where children are most at risk, and yet this bill does nothing to regulate or address the issue of having a safety regime for children around people who work either in volunteer organisations or who volunteer for organisations where children are placed in care. And I think that is a great gaping hole in this legislation. So again, as it is so often with this government, sadly, it is a grand title that they've afforded this bill, but it doesn't. The detail doesn't actually match up with the rhetoric, sadly. Because if this really was a bill that addressed vulnerable children, then it would deal with, as well as the issue of children being placed at risk of abuse, it would also deal with the vulnerability of living in poverty for those 285,000 children. The good news, Mr Speaker, is that the Labour Party has got plans to do exactly this. And I want to recommend to people listening to this debate Labour's Best Start policy. Because if the government was really serious about addressing the issues for vulnerable children, then they would be agreeing with the approach being proposed by Labour. So the Best Start policy ensures that every child who lives in a family where the family income is less than $150,000 per annum, would receive, on the birth of that child, $60 extra a week. And for low-income families, that payment would stay in place up until the age of 3. That, Mr Speaker, is a very real and practical way of addressing poverty and vulnerable children living in poverty. And if the government was serious about addressing the concerns of vulnerable children, that is exactly where they would be heading for. They would be heading down that track of ensuring that all children get the very best start in life. But, Mr Speaker, again, a government who is really serious about dealing with children and making sure that they got the best start in life would be supporting my bill to extend paid parental leave to 6 months. Instead, the government is deploying all sorts of delaying tactics, everything they can think of to stop that bill from going through this House, including the extreme threat of a financial veto. That is what the government thinks of vulnerable children. It's actually prepared to use the most extreme tool available to it as a government to stop children from getting supported in those very early and vulnerable first 6 months of their lives. And that, Mr Speaker, I think says it all about this government's priority for supporting children in those very early vulnerable months. But, Mr Speaker, that is also part of Labour's Best Start programme, the policy that actually will deal with the needs of vulnerable children, rather than this bill which addresses a narrow slither of the issue. However narrow the slither is, it is an important slither, I must add, because of course we want to ensure that children who are actually at risk of being harmed by adults, and it really it bothers me to stand in this Parliament and say it, because, you know, we as adults should be the people on whom vulnerable children can depend. They should be able to depend that when they are in the company of adults that they are safe, but sadly that is not the case. And this bill does a little to address that issue, but it doesn't do a lot to address it. I was, however, pleased to see that the government did back down in the end on the idea of using child harm prevention orders. It was the view of the Labour Party and other parties represented on the Select Committee right from the outset that these were not going to work, that the child harm prevention orders were going to be significantly overreaching, and the Minister came to that decision at the end of the day. But it took many submissions from a wide range of submitters to convince the Minister that actually taking measures against people who had not had a conviction, for whom there was no evidence or proof that they had offended against children, that was not workable and it was going a step too far, but they came to their senses in the end. Mr Speaker, there's one other issue that came to light during the submissions on this bill that I would like to briefly give some oxygen to during this debate, and that is the issue from a number of organisations who talk to us about the plight of children who are extremely vulnerable because they have severe disabilities, their family has been unable to cope with those disabilities, and they have ended up being institutionalised for life as a result of that. And the plea from a number of those organisations was to say to the Select Committee, for goodness sake, if these parents aren't willing or able to give a home to these children, there are other foster families who actually would like to do that, and that child should have the right to actually not be institutionalised for life, but have a home for life. And I think that is something that I'd like to see this Parliament give some consideration to in the future. Mr Speaker, the Labour Party is supporting this bill. We don't think it goes far enough.
Point of order, the Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Mr Speaker, I've consulted with the other whips from parties that are represented in the House, and I want to seek the leave of the House for the House to have a moment's silence to note the passing today of Right Honourable Sir Owen Woodhouse, ONZ KBE DSC, former President of the Court of Appeal, Judge of the New Zealand Supreme Court, President of the Law Commission.